I think that's feathering her cap that she would do that.
Cats.
Cause June's got nothing to offer. I mean, just.
Did I drop it way too far away? My bad,
Just,
She had to bend.
no, it had you stretched.
Oh, no, I was glad.
Oh, I need one. Can I have one?
You don't get one.
Should have one.
Maybe.
Seems
Let me go put it
reasonable.
over there.
So he has to walk, bend, and
That's something that has retained since my short time in the car business, is that when we go to the dealership, somebody with the keys, you reach out, they was like that, and of course not tossing right. So that happens all the time in our house still. Actually, it didn't happen like 3 years, and I got Wes on it the other day.
You can stand on your head. Well. See how wee she was in her beautiful red hair? That was my sister's picture. It's like, I have that.
Look at baby.
They being just gorgeous. I had just come back. I lived in California, so still had my California look back. Oh, so, yeah, I guess I'm sure Julie has this picture close to behind her. Jason did, I don't think he believed that I was hanging water at one point, so I brought him a picture showing that I actually did hang water. I actually did. I'm just telling stories. This is when I was teaching Catherine.
Yes, I remember her like that. She was.
She was.
They have that many kids every year. I was there, I was 12 years. And every time I took pictures, a lot of kids.
I had that many in third grade, but kindergarten is.
That's a lot.
You gotta keep up with
But
it.
I taught Montessori, and they really more focused, like I just go around and give a lesson, here for geography, y'all do that. And then over here, West for that, y'all do that, you have a question, and I'm gonna be over here doing this, you know.
You didn't try to have the whole class focus on one thing at one time.
No, I had 4 over here and 4 over here in groups, and that way if they wanted to. You were kind of huge. Yeah, I was. That's the whole thing.
No, that didn't sound right.
No, I was very young and cute.
But with the blonde hair.
Yeah, I was telling her I just come back from living in California, and so I started in California. My tan, I started a tan at that point, so. But yeah, that's sort of college. Taught 4 years there, and I came back home, this is where I was born, and just started teaching. Until I got cancer, and I didn't teach anymore, I just stopped. I mean,
Good reason to stop.
that was not my intention was to go back, better.
Once you get out, you don't wanna go back.
Well, you know, I love teaching, and hadn't gotten cancer, probably would have retired as a teacher. But it was just one of those things where it was about a year of treatment, and then a year to feel that.
Yeah.
And after 2 years, I'm like, kind of lost the theory.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do. This is pretty cool, I'm out of here. I'll stop.
There you go. Did you see the photo uploaded for Louise's request about
No.
their picture? This is, these are the partners in crime at the house. One of them's not doing something, the other one is. Keita the cat was best friends with Edie, our previous dog. Like, that was just best buddies, and she couldn't figure out why the new dog didn't love her as much quite yet. So this is them the other day.
Aw.
She's using her as a, Ellie's using the cat as a pillow.
That's about right. That's about right. Oh, that's so cute.
Yeah, so she was just laying there. And Cheetah was like, I don't know if I like this or not. When Ellie didn't weigh so much, Cheetah didn't mind it, just laying on her. Now she's a big old blockhead. Somebody be so kind to say a prayer for us. And if you don't want to say it out loud, you can say I will, and at the end say amen after you pray to yourself. Doesn't matter to me. God's people said. Today we start a new section in the book of Romans. And it is one of Paul's great turns. He makes these phenomenal turns in the book because we said it does this building up thing, right? Building up, building up. I wish there was a physicist among us. Is it true that at some point a tire, when it contacts the road for just a moment, has no speed, has no motion?
I don't know. I never thought about it.
I heard this. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's this idea at some point it has to grip.
Right, it grips.
Right.
Unless it's skidding, it must be.
Or at least to some degree,
Right.
there is a
Yeah.
slowing down of that.
Right.
And then that turn happens, right?
Yeah.
And that's the momentum.
Yeah.
In whatever way a physicist would explain this, I probably am very wrong. But I think the point still remains is that Paul does this rotating way of writing, and every so often it grips and it forces the conversation along. And that's sort of where we're at in this. This is one of those moments where it really grips hard and it pushes us to understand what he's talking about. Which I love that about Paul. I think there's something really cool about let me make a thesis and 3 points in conclusion, right? He's rotating this thing and building, and he makes these grand statements that continue throughout the book. So that's where we're at right now. Do I have you? Are you thinking now? Is that what I got you doing? Did I make a mistake?
Well, no, I'm already thinking about something else.
Okay. I got you stirring.
So I kind of read through what N.T. Wright said, and he talked about like movies, and you think you might be watching a movie and everything gets to this point where there's just no hope. And then all of a sudden, the people in white horses come riding in.
Okay.
Or, there's some big turning point. Maybe it's a romance, and, it broke up, and the girl's about to get on the plane, and here he comes running down the airplane. So, a turning point. And,
Gotcha.
that's what the "but now"
Right.
is
Right.
here. He's built everything up to this crisis point, and
That's funny. I glanced through that section, but I
Yeah.
skipped kind of through that to get kind of where he was going later, and I didn't realize that's what he had written.
Yeah.
That is too good. Yeah, exactly. And that's that but now, right? So let's go back just 2 verses. Anybody have the one from last week? I don't have it in front of me. If you've got just the last 2 verses of last week, and Gary might have it pretty quickly because he's got the book at home. Oh, you got it?
No, it was like I got papers. So bad.
so like 19 and 20.
Yeah, right. Just to kind of reorient us where we're at in the conversation.
Now we know that whatever the law says, it is speaking to those who are in the law. The purpose of this is that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be brought to the bar of God's judgment. No mere mortal, you see, can be declared to be in the right before God on the basis of the works of the law. What you get through the law is the knowledge of sin.
So Paul's identifying not a, we're going to talk about this all night long tonight, not a works righteousness versus faith argument, as much as that it's not through our doing of the law that we are doing righteousness. And there's a little bit different in those 2 things. And the difference is you're not earning it, like we're just saying, we're earning God's grace. The argument that N.T. Wright and others make is that they were using to identify how they were different than other people. We're different than them because of our works of the law. And it distanced their ability to be able to pass along to others the beauty of the law. If you say, well, you can't be a part of it, then how do you share it? And so that's kind of this dynamic that we're dealing with. And so, as he says, there's no one righteous. There is no way of claiming our identity as part of the covenant. We don't get to do that as certain groups. He says, but now. And so, what does but now mean? What is but now? The law has shown everyone guilty. Period. But now.
After Jesus.
After. And we've not necessarily spoken out loud about Jesus yet, but that's where we know we're coming because we're all Christians. But now, so we know we're going, okay, this is the part where Jesus comes, okay. What else? What does but now mean?
So that no longer holds?
As opposed to,
Mm-hmm.
there was this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now, all right? What else is in but now? He teased around it a little bit. Let's just tease that a little bit more. But now. Not just after Jesus, but now. Right? Now. That whatever is happening in this, it's not just some post-Jesus thing, which it is. And it's not just as opposed to, which it is. It's that it exists in the now. But now this is true. Right? But now is not, but now we'll talk about so-and-so that happened previously. Though that's part of it. The but now means, but now there's something that we are participating in this moment that is so much different than that. And that is incredibly important to Paul, right? Because what he's doing, we'll talk about this too, is he's grabbing, you saw at one time the word eschatology that I just like saying because it just is fun to say. This idea that there is an end judgment is an eschatological moment. And Paul says that God or Jesus grabbed that moment from some distant future and brought it into the now. We can see now what righteousness and the greatness and the covenant justice of God looks like and who it's for. everybody has faith. So, but now becomes important so that we feel the presence of this moment. That but now exists today, in other words. Does that make sense? Is that? I think to me it gains a little bit of, ooh, you know what I mean? Like a little bit of, I don't know, what's the word? Help me.
Well, one thing is the heading of this little paragraph is the unveiling of God's covenant justice. So you have this imagery of ta-da. I mean, you know.
Throwing it open.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's interesting.
I mean, I'm trying to remember, we kind of read that every mouth was shut.
Mm.
And they,
Mhm.
talked about that's what happens in these courts of law when you get to the point that you've got no defense. And he just went through and he showed that Jews and Gentiles alike, they're like this.
Yes.
There's no defense. We're totally defenseless in this courtroom. But now.
Let's read it.
And
Let's read it. You're right. Thank you. That's perfect. So let's read it. But now, quite apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bore witness to this, we're going to talk about that in a second. But now, God's covenant justice has been displayed. God's covenant justice comes into operation through the faithfulness of Jesus, the Messiah, for the benefit of all who have faith. But now, because exactly, Gary, right?
Yeah.
And that's perfect. The but now says the defense has either rested or been told they have to rest. Remember, either cover your mouth when you're done with your defense or somebody will cover it for you when you shouldn't be talking anymore. That was the idea of being silenced. And you have a defendant who has nothing left to say, and not in a good way. The defense didn't, they needed a better lawyer, right? You had, you had as the prosecuting attorney, you had Satan. So you need a better lawyer, right? And in that, God announces what? You're justified. You are part of the covenant. You are not discarded. You are part of the covenant, and we're going to go on with exactly what Julie is saying, because of the faithfulness of Jesus the Messiah. It doesn't matter who you are. Now, it also goes on to say you have to believe in that faith, right? We're going to talk about that. But envisioning that courtroom, like Gary says, is exactly what Paul wanted them to do at the time. You had a defense that rested, and it doesn't look good. And God just overlooked everything that the prosecution said and called you innocent, justified, part of the covenant community. What is the proper reaction to that in a courtroom? The judge just called you innocent and you knew you were guilty. What is your reaction? And you knew somebody else took the punishment. What is your reaction in the courtroom? It ain't silence. What do you do, Ruth?
I'd probably be real happy and run.
Run.
Yay.
Around and around and around that courtroom if need be, right?
Y'all are out the door.
Out the door.
Before they change their mind.
Before I change your mind, yeah. What else? What do you do? So what do you do?
What I do, depends on who kind of person I am.
No, you. You
I
just
mean,
got you.
I'd be like, I'm happy that somebody else took the blame for me. So it would not be a good happy. Yeah.
Well, if that person who took the blame took it willfully and knew what God was going to do in the end and was brought to fullness again.
I don't know. I think
If it gets difficult.
My basic person would just go, yes, they took it for me, yes. And I'm kid's response though to my.
That's a conflicted thing.
It is. I mean, the person I am, I'd be happy, but I'd be like, it's an empty happiness because someone else is involved now. You know, someone's on my conscience now. So.
And it was even in the judge's design a little bit. N.T. Wright goes a little far into that punishment side of it. I don't go where he always goes, and some of the ones that join that. To me, there is a strength in the argument that it was God's design all along for there to be life no matter what we did to Christ. To me, there is a great strength in that. Paul might disagree with me a little bit. Right? And I'm okay with that. He and I disagree. We'll talk about it when I get to heaven. He ain't going to kick me out. Like, you know what I mean? I got no problem with that. It's called atonement theories. And Paul is very much in the idea that the wrath of God was expressed against Christ, the remnant of Israel. Every time I've ever seen it was people doing evil that did that to Christ. But I think that's an interesting argument to be made. But the point of it is that in whatever capacity, we didn't pay the price, and the proper reaction to one who calls us innocent by whatever manner is falling at their feet. You did what? You made a way for me not to. Us, by the way. Us. All of us. Every one of us. To be innocent of the charges of disobeying the covenant. What? Have you not seen who we were? Pagan and Jew both? Slave and free, male and female? That's the statement that Paul's trying to make in this, that no matter what happened, but now, apart from the law, why does it have to be apart from the law? I thought the law was a good thing in all this. Why apart from the law? Though the law and the prophets bore witness to it. If it's in the law, the Gentiles can't be a part of it. And it just said, right before this, that the law was what judged them as guilty. So it can't be the law that did it. It was God's covenant justice displayed in this faithfulness of Jesus the Messiah for the benefit of all who have faith. Now that's very interesting. For a long time, the argument has been, and still is, that we have to have faith in Jesus. What does faith in Jesus mean to you? Help me here. This is something I need to hear. What is faith in Jesus to you? Or what have you brought up hearing it as? Faith in Jesus means blank. Andrew.
Well, the faith and the faithfulness of Jesus is that I have faith he did absolutely everything that is required.
Yes. As opposed to everybody else.
He's done what's required to redeem me, and anyone who believes in him, who trusts him.
That's not always how I've heard that said. I've also heard that said, faith in Jesus means I just believe that that's the Son of God. And I say I'm sorry for sinfulness, right? And there's this giving of righteousness to me through my belief in who that is. I think what Gary's saying is a little bit different than that. The faith becomes it isn't who Christ is, right? But the faith becomes that Christ walked the exact path that had to happen based on God's will for the redemption of all creation. Right? That faith that I have, that path that Christ walked in every moment that he lived, right, is the path of redemption. Which in a few minutes is going to bring that statement of turn the other cheek into a whole different light. Because what did Christ do in that path was turning the cheek except sometimes he turned it to yellow people. Right? So even that's kind of odd. So anyway, that's what I want us to look at in those first two sentences. Let's see if there's anything else in this. If it were me, I would block out my Bible from 321 to 425, because that's this section, and it all kind of goes together and answers the questions that we've been asking all along in this. Then interesting that apart from the law and the prophets pointed to it still. And that, do you remember videos at some point? Have you ever watched these videos that they take the prophecies of Jesus and it uses it as like proof that Jesus is the Messiah? Have you seen videos like this? I saw one when I was in college the last time. It was like this. We went to a place in Israel. We might go there. But it's the other place that they think Jesus might have been buried. Like there's one place, and then there's this other place that this other guy thinks that he saw you've seen the rock that looks like the skull? Sometimes that's this place, right? And it was like found in the 80s. And there wasn't really any reference to it, other than a couple of things. But when they come in, they give this presentation of see that, see that, see that, see that. And because of all this, you can believe that the whole story is true. Does that make sense? And we were all sitting there, and the woman that was doing this was new, and she was talking to a bunch of preachers. And I'm like, bless her heart, this is not. I went to apologize to her later. I was like, you got thrown into one there. She's such a beautiful soul. But the point is that so often we think of the prophets as, let's look at them to prove that Jesus is who the Son of God, or whatever was coming, or whatever. I think to go one level past that is to say that talking about what was the line? Prophets, whatever it is. Oh, though the law and the prophets bore witness to it, is this idea that there has been a continuity and a reliability of God's promise all along of this covenant. There's never been a moment when the covenant wasn't true. There wasn't this one covenant that kind of fell through and this another one. It's this covenant that the law has always talked about, the prophets have always talked about. And he didn't include the third one, but he could have the writings, much like the Psalms and some of those. All of them pointed to what? That God had made a covenant with Abraham. Look at Genesis 15, that's where all this starts. God had a covenant with Abraham, and that covenant is still intact, and it is now intact through Jesus Christ. And that we are all a part of it. That's where that's where we are. What else do I want to talk about in this? Covenant justice, we're using that word. If you look in your Bible, you probably have a different word. Anybody look in their own Bible right now? You probably have it where it says righteousness in verse 21, probably. Righteousness of God. The reason that he's changed that is there's this called imputing righteousness, this idea that as the moment we are saved, that we are given the righteousness of Christ. He's kind of pushing back on that a little bit, and the argument is instead that God's righteousness is God's keeping that covenant intact, no matter what, loving us through it and redeeming us as part of it. So it changes the view a little bit of what we're talking about when we're talking about God's righteousness, God's rightness. And that rightness, that covenant justice, and this is the important part of this entire thing, is that it takes from that future justice moment, this future judgment moment that is still absolutely intact once and for all, but drags it also into the present. So that today we know this. Today we are judged as part of the community if we have faith to be in it, not at some later event. And that's the way you get the Gentiles in, is to make it now. You can't do it later. Right? That's what has been said all along. All right. Any thoughts before we go on? 22 through 24, God's covenant justice comes into operation through the faithfulness of Jesus the Messiah for the benefit of all who have faith, of all who have faith. For there is no distinction, all sin and fell short of the glory of God, and by God's grace they are freely declared to be in the right, to be members of the covenant through the redemption which is found in the Messiah Jesus. The covenant is being held together, being continued, being held on to, being what? Fulfilled through the Messiah Jesus Christ. And that's the important part. Let's see where I want to jump to. Where is that? At the end of 23, and this is for there is no distinction, all sin and fell short of God's glory. This is the problem we've been trying to resolve, right? What the problem is that there's sinfulness. There's this Adam and Eve thing that broke our image. Is that okay to say? Because we're created in the image of God to glorify God, to reflect God's glory, and broken mirrors don't do that real well, right? So in the midst of this, we have to recognize that this whole thing was for this resolve of the ancient problem, which is that we fall short of presenting God's glory to the world, in essence. And again, it's for all who believe. So let's keep going then, 25 and 26. God put Jesus forth as the place of mercy. Two things I want to say about this real quick. God put Jesus forth is the same language as, do you know what the shewbread is in the temple? Is the bread, I think it's 12 loaves. I think. Nonetheless, it represents the 12 tribes of Israel. It sits right outside the Holy of Holies in Israel and was shaped in a certain way and was set out for however long. And it was always there. And it represented God's faithfulness of always providing. That makes sense? And that word was placed there by the priest. And so that language is the same. So Paul didn't do these things on accident. We know this. And so he's kind of looking at that temple idea of Jesus is that that fullness that everything needs. That's what those loaves meant. And then the other part is as the place of mercy. I didn't put my thing up here because I'm not going to write the Greek down. But this word, do you know what the mercy seat is? Are you familiar with this? On the ark, if I remember right, y'all, I'm just not where I'm my strongest. There was the seat, and I think there were the two angels or two cherubim or whatever on the sides of the seat. And Aaron was to, it was the place, Aaron was to, that had incense go up around it to bring about the presence of God, right, to represent that. And then for the sacrifice, he threw blood on it. And the mercy seat was the opportunity to atone for the sins of Israel. And so that seat, right, would have been the place where God and humanity sort of connected, would be in this seat, the mercy seat. Later on, you can see them. You may have seen this in Israel. Did you see the mercy seat in any of the temples? They had it carved in the rock or the wall. There was one in the one we went to. They had a mercy seat, and that was for this idea of the atonement. And then in some church traditions, you know the big chair down front that you go sit in when it's time to come to the Lord. Have you ever been in a church that does? Ransom Temple does this. If you come down front at the altar call, they have, I'm talking about a throne chair, y'all. I mean, it is something. And they bring it out during the altar call, used to, and sit there. And that would be where you would go if you made a profession to the Lord, is go sit in the mercy seat. And you are, again, just a continuation of it, you are at that spot meeting the presence of the Lord with my sinfulness, right? That's what he's talking about when he uses this line, God put Jesus forth, the idea of bread, as the place of mercy, into the mercy seat. Through his faithfulness, by means of his blood, he did this to demonstrate his covenant justice through the passing over and the divine forbearance of sins committed beforehand. How do we say that better? God did this through the faithfulness by means of Jesus' blood, this sacrificial moment. We're going to talk about that, what that looks like in a minute. He did this to demonstrate his covenant justice, his commitment to the covenant, through the passing over of sins committed beforehand. Do you remember anywhere so far in what we've read where we've talked about that idea of passing over of sins? Do you remember maybe a chapter ago where we talked about the wrath of God looked like patience? Right? Paul is bringing it back around. So God has shown the covenant justice through the passing over in the divine patience of God of sins committed beforehand. This was demonstrate his covenant justice in the present time. That is, that he himself is in the right. That he declares to be in the right everyone who trusts in the faithfulness of Jesus. Here is, how in the world do we get to where this sacrifice is necessary? That makes us kind of feel like icky, right? There are some sacrificial atonement models that make me feel like God's a child abuser. Like, I don't like those. They just don't make me feel good, right? Catch this. There is an idea in that day that one's martyrdom, what's a martyr? Someone who dies for a cause, right? That one's martyrdom could forgive the sins of a nation. There was this thought. It's hard to trace in a short time, but you can go to Daniel and see this. There's temple cult stuff brings human suffering. It's a weird thing. But also we know this one. Isaiah 40 through 55, that 15 chapters, contains the suffering servant in 53, right? And in 53, the entire idea is that the suffering of this king figure would bring about the redemption of the nation. That's the entire suffering servant. He suffered as a servant for the sins of the people, right? That's that Isaiah 53, if you go back and read it. And it's 40 through 55, the whole thing. Take that thought and add whoever Deborah Deaton is. Anybody know Deborah Deaton? She called me. Add into this so about 160 BC, 260 years before Christ, there was what was called the Maccabean Revolt. And these were a bunch of, just a small group of rebels who basically kicked out the people that were taking care of them and had a nation of their own for about 100 years, something. Like their own, they kind of got the monarchy back, which is cool because it had disappeared for so long. And in that, they found writings. And some of the writings, and I want to read it. This comes from 4 Maccabees 6:24 through 29. You will not find this in your Bible unless you have a very different Bible than mine. But it's the stories of the revolution. And it says this: when the king's advisors saw that he remained confident in the face of torture and didn't appreciate their compassion, the guards carried him into the fire. They burned his body with diabolical devices, and then they threw him on the ground and poured disgusting liquids into his nostrils. Bad time to live, y'all. Eleazar was now burned down to his bones on the edge of death. He raised his eyes toward God and said, God, you know that I could have saved myself. Does this sound familiar? Instead, I'm being burned and tortured to death for the sake of your law. Have mercy on your people. Make our punishment sufficient for their sake. Purify them with my blood, and that my life is in exchange for theirs. And when he said this, the holy man died with dignity from the torture. By thinking clearly, he resisted even while facing the pains of death. for the sake of the law. Does that sound a little bit familiar? But the point in that is there was a long tradition of those who martyred could overcome the sins of the nation. And so for Paul, this is not that odd. This falls right in line with the tradition that they came in. Do you see what I mean? And so, when you see that idea of the atonement, where is it? I'm missing it. Where's the atonement for the by means of his blood? Yeah, through faith by means of his blood. Did this to demonstrate the covenant through the sins committed beforehand. I argue this is not a way of saying how salvation came upon it with that, but an explanation of how does brokenness bring about forgiveness. And God isn't some vengeful God. It's like God resolved this idea of sinfulness in this. All right, where do we want to go? This idea of God's faithfulness through all of this just rolls through it, and the point is this, is that the action of Jesus Christ has changed everything, right? That's that justification. Everything is made right for those who believe. And in that, Paul's argument is that we have a calling to participation in that. And so it's not just some passive salvation, it is literally a calling into the very life that Christ allowed us, which is that we reflect God's glory through our faith, our obedient faith. All right, Romans 27-31. So he said now that the covenant justice in the present time has set everything right. He declares everything to be right for everyone who trusts in the faithfulness of Jesus. And so Paul says, so what happens to boasting? What does that mean, boasting? Who's he talking to? Who has been worried about this whole time boasting? Jews, right? So he's speaking immediately to them. So what happens to boasting? It is ruled out. You cannot boast based on who you are as a person of faith. I am thrilled to death. Can I just say this out loud? I think it is so amazing and fantastic that the only time in history when people have boasted about who they are in God is in first century Judea, and has never happened at any other point in history. Right? This is the eternal problem. It's ruled out. Through what sort of law? The law of works? No. Through the law of faith. And Paul does something incredibly interesting here. He basically comes up with the idea that there are two laws. One is the law of works. And that law of works means I do these things, and that's who I am, and I am a Jew because you can see it from multiple ways, right? And we ain't them, and we're kind of separate. And that was always the argument. The law of faith is what? What is the law of faith? Law of faith.
Well, it's kind of the opposite of the law of works to an extent, in that instead of boasting, you come without a plea, without one plea, as the song says, and totally reliant through faith on God's mercy, and so there can be no boasting.
Today we deal with a problem. We deal with Luther versus Rome, right? We've always heard about Luther versus Rome. We've always heard, we may have heard about Augustine versus Pelagius. Pelagius was a guy that said works matters. He said that there's not really such thing as sin. What's the word I'm trying to use? Original sin. That everybody's kind of good. We all have free will. We can decide right or wrong. Pelagius had some arguments. He was a pretty good theologian, but he got rid out of the church because, don't say that out loud. And so we have a problem with Augustine, who always said there is this, he went to Rome and it was horrible. He's like, look at all his sinfulness, and look at this decrepit world, right? Everybody's broken. And so you have this argument. And you have also an argument about during the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment said there's these abstract truths, and then there are worldly realities. And those don't always match up, right? For instance, faith and science. They'll separate those in the midst of an enlightenment. When Gary and I argue both, you can find God in science and you can find science in God. I think we would argue both. I'll go for that. You had faith is spiritual, work is material that came out of the Enlightenment. And that's how we often read this section. So, remember, it's who is redeemed and not how. And what's so important about this is that what God is pointing us back to is Abraham. And that's been the promise from the very beginning, was that he had faith, and he was given the law to respond to. And in that, you are shown how to live. For instance, how to treat strangers in the land, how to care for widows and orphans, how to be a peaceful nation, how to be a not peaceful nation, depending on how you read it. And so you have all of these ways, and it says Abraham has said that over and over, that Abraham is the beginning of this. And so Paul really offers two ways of looking at the Torah. One is through identity, and one is through a faith that began with Abraham, because Abraham wasn't Jewish. Abraham was just this dude from Iraq. Like, that's just all he was. And he was brought into faith, and brought into this covenant through faith, because he was such a great person. The issue can be found, interestingly, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's why I bring all this up. Is that if you have this idea of the law as an identity, here's what happens. You're given a law that says, don't murder. We can all agree that that's probably not a good thing to go around doing, is murdering people. I hope we all agree on that in this room. But then we start dividing up on what that means. What does self-defense mean? What does defense of someone else mean, right? Great argument is, there are the ideas of nonviolent stances, but that really changes the moment Julie is getting whooped outside. Because now if I step back and go, I'm sorry, I'm nonviolent, I'm just selfish, right? What does nonviolent mean in that moment if you're going to claim it? And so we start dividing up how we see these things, right? Well, as soon as we start dividing up how we see these things, we start disagreeing with each other. And we stand, I am on this side and you are on that side of this argument. As we do that, there becomes this splitting and this dividing. And the Dead Sea Scrolls show it sure as the world. There are these laws, and you can see in the writings of the Qumran community where they were debating what is the next law that we have to understand that. And they had these huge arguments with each other. We do the same thing. Drive up and down Nolensville Road. Like, how many churches between here and Bell Road? And we all got different names. And we all say we get along, but when it comes down to it, what is true belief and what isn't? We need to talk. That's the problem with the idea of the law of works versus the idea of law of faith. And let's read the rest of that. So what happens to boasting is ruled out through what sort of law? The law of works? No, the law of faith. We calculate, you see, we understand you see that a person is declared to be right on the basis of faith apart from the works of the law. Or does God only belong to the Jews? That's what he said all along. No. Doesn't he belong to the nations as well? Yes, of course, to all the nations as well, since God is one. He will make the declaration in the right of the circumcised on the basis of faith and of the uncircumcised through faith. Do we then abolish the law through faith? No. We establish it. This is the law, this kingdom in which we live. This is the law, and it's done out of the way of the serpent. In some crazy paradox, obedient trust in Jesus Christ's faith, remember that from early on, we're justified, and in doing so, we fulfill the law. The only way I can figure out what in the world that means is this. When you teach a kid to tie shoelaces, I swear it's like their hands don't know they're on the same body, and the shoelaces don't know they're supposed to go together. Right? That's just kind of, they don't fit. Like, it doesn't matter. It's just, and there's frustration over it. And at some point, you take those two streams, the idea of faith and law, these two hands, and you tie this bow up, and all of a sudden it comes out, and you're like, what'd you look at? It's tied up beautifully in this faith that works become so intimately a part of it that it is just faith. The faith in the Jesus Christ sacrifice, that way of being, that servant that he's called us to be, those teachings, all of that. We have faith in that. And that ends up tying the most perfect little bow, and the kid has no clue how they did it. He just did it because Mama told him how, or Daddy showed him how. May use their hands. Oh, look what he just did. That's the only way I could come up with this idea of how you tie in faith and the law so tightly. They started as two and ended up becoming one. We sit here and notice that we talk about faith, and all the denominations talk about faith, and we just swear we are faith alone and nothing else matters, and there's no whatever identity problems or anything else. And then we go to a worship service where they have contemporary music, and I'm like, oh, I can't find God in this. And we can, right? We may not, because it's not a tradition or whatever. But there's always that sense of what is proper and right. What is proper and right way to serve communion? I was at a church, if you didn't put that cloth over that communion table, we could not have communion. Christ couldn't be in the midst of this because that's what we did. My grandmama did it. So it's there. And that can be a really powerful thing, the traditions of the elders, right? It can mean something. But if we can't just fathom God in this without that cloth being there, what have we done? Right? And so I'm saying there is a balance in that. But there's all that idea. What works do we require when we say we don't require works? Just a thought. Any thought on that before I move on? I wrote down which theologies that we have are not actually about God, but more the way we cement our way. What theologies do I have about God that really don't describe who God actually is, but sort of describe how I want God to look? I think I have those.
Maybe even how we always thought he should.
I should. Always been taught this. It's the only thing we know.
And you don't want to question that because then you go, oh, am I questioning my faith because I am thinking about something differently?
What things, I don't know if we want to even say it aloud, what things to us are faith-shaking when we think about them? One of mine is this. I've said this time and time again. And our confession of faith, I think, is a beautiful statement on this. It says that God salvation for us, all those who, I don't know if the word says accepted or something, which is awful Pelagian, but have faith in it maybe, and all those who God redeems without faith for whatever reason God chooses, right? So there's this out in our confession of faith that says God may do things that we don't understand and say to people, which I think is a pretty awesome statement because I don't want to be the judge, right? What of someone that the church has hurt, a Christian has hurt, a pastor has hurt? We get a story just the other day again in Nashville of some pastor doing something just horrific and evil and got busted for it, as he should have. Those folks who experience such a negative of God, not of God, but of the expression of God, right? That they cannot bring themselves back to the faith because they're so scarred in their lifetime. And maybe people of faith didn't go to them as should be done. Do I believe in a God who is going to cut them off and send them straight to hell? Maybe they're a wonderful human being. Maybe they are like the Gentiles who did follow the way of God and didn't even know it. Do I believe that person's going to hell? And I have a huge problem with that question. And when I first started struggling with that, I was like, what do I mean is faith then? What is the basis of what I think has to happen for someone to be a member of the community of faith? Right?
Right. I mean, nothing, my example's not at all like that, but I had to,
Sure.
as I grew and became a member of Cumberland Presbyterian Church instead of the very conservative Lutheran church that I grew up in, I had to say, oh, you mean that if you don't sprinkle a baby, he's going to hell? Because that's actually what they taught, or at least I understood it that way. Whether that was the real theology, that was what got handed down. You know, you had to be physically baptized and as an infant, or corrected as soon as you found out you hadn't been.
Salvific.
Yeah.
There was blessing of the Spirit. Second Spirit.
So anyway, so that was, one of the first things that I went, oh, well, does that mean I don't have faith? And I thought, no. No, but I was old enough by then, I could, yet young enough, that I could let go.
Yeah. And I think coming to grips with any theology that we question comes with those moments of call it doubt, but I think it can be routed to, you're nodding with me, I think it can be routed to a real strength too, to be able to venture into the questions. What does it mean for my life to be saved? That's a scary question when you dig that into it, because you don't know what's down there necessarily until you dig in. And some of those answers can be invigorating, but they can be a dark tunnel you're walking down, so you can find the light switch. Step a toe and toe or two. Hey, I can tell you, the first semester I was at seminary, I thought I didn't have faith anymore. I was like, I'm not just a heathen? Is that like, do I just not, nothing I believe stands up to the power, to the proof of Scripture? And in piecing it back together over time, I had a very immature faith, just incredibly immature. And I think that's part of life. Maybe is continuing to piece together that faith. Let's read just real fast. I'm going to read through where we're at. So the idea of establishing the law, when that law is the thanksgiving to God, right? Is this idea of we are establishing the law? This idea we're going to show our gratitude by how we live in this way of Christ. So verse 1, what should we say then? So this is an idea that's going to build through the next couple of chapters. We're turning to Abraham pretty heavy. What should we say with him? Have we found Abraham to Have we found Abraham to be our ancestor in human fleshly sense? Who's the we? Christians. He is speaking specifically to the Christian group right here. What shall we say then? Have we found Abraham to be our ancestor in a human fleshly sense? After all, if Abraham was reckoned in the right of the basis of works, he has grounds to boast, but not in God's presence. In other words, no, we are not in the family line. And that is incredibly important, the bloodline. And that's incredibly important because he's saying that this is not a Jewish ethnic church. This is a church that includes everybody. And that's the necessary point that he's making. We are not family flesh Abraham people. So, because what does the Bible say? Abraham believed God, and it was calculated in his favor, indicating that he was in the right. He believed God. Now, when someone works, the reward they get is calculated on the basis of generosity, but on the basis of what they're owed. See the argument he's making, which is so good. But if someone doesn't work, but simply believes in the one who declares the ungodly to be right, the person's faith is calculated on the side of covenant justice, of this grace given all along. We see the same thing when David speaks of the blessing that comes to someone who God calculates to be in the right apart from his works. What's the point there, apart from his works? How can you be right apart from your works if you're David? We know the story. What was his big work? But Bathsheba. Don't do that. And you were found right despite your works. I was found right despite my works is David's argument, right? David speaks of the blessing that comes to someone whom God calculates to be in the right apart from their works. Blessed are those whose law breaking is forgiven and whose sins have been covered over, David. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not calculate sin. And so the entire point of this second section, again, is to influence the argument to say this is including everybody in this. A lot of times we use this as, I think there's been an idea of when does salvation happen, you have faith, and you have this. He's just saying it includes everybody because Abraham was included, not based on works of any kind. He believed. He was in Ur, or wherever he was, over in Iraq, in the middle of nowhere along the Nile, and he was called and he moved his family across the desert in faith. He was called and he went. And that's what we're called to do as well. I talked a lot because I wanted to get through verse 8. I really wanted to get through 15, but that's okay. We're going to finish out 4 next time, but I hope that you're able to go back and read. Read the first 3 chapters as we talked about it. This letter to the Roman church, this idea that there was all these different kind of people trying to figure out who Jesus was, how to follow Jesus, how to be a church. Paul's writing to them, talking about how they all have to recognize they are one body. And it's done because Christ brought future judgment into the now and did it for all people. And that's the argument. Read that and then follow in and just kind of keep it fresh in your mind as you do so. And hopefully we can, as we trudge through, we find our way. Any thoughts? Let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you that you give us a history that goes back to the very beginning of the covenant. We are ancestors of Abraham. When he walked outside the tent and you had him look at the stars and told him that would be the number of people in his covenant that you made. We were one of those stars. This church, this place, this time, this world that we live in today. And we thank you for that because it gives us a grounding, a basis to understand that you have always been the God of creation. You have always been with us. You have always promised us that you are a forgiving and a patient God. And for whatever reason that we don't understand, you brought that moment to such a high 2,000 years ago through such a low, that today we get to experience that faith, that we get to be a part of it and live in the midst of it. We get to live in this forgiveness, in this servant mindset, in all these ways of Christ that absolutely should not work, should not be reality, and yet they're the path that we live on. And so we ask you, God, to remind us that anytime that we take a step down the path. Place the vision of the risen Christ in front of us. Give us the spirit of the wind at our back. Fill us with your presence, whatever you have to do, but allow us to see the beauty of what you have done to fulfill the covenant so that we are a part of it today. We are children of Abraham. And God, we thank you that we have that history and that memory. We ask you to strengthen us and guide us and lead us in our faith and show us that we are one with all of God's kingdom because you made it so through Jesus Christ, our Messiah. And God's people say. I could almost be a Pelagian. Almost.